Okay. Okay, so today we are continuing on with the book of Joshua. We have covered a lot of the information about the actual campaign part of Joshua already. We've only got really another section of battles here in chapter 11 about the northern enemies. The enemies that are going to be coming. We just got done reading about this huge big battle that Joshua fought in the Israelites. When Joshua prayed for the sun to stand still, and God answered his prayer and apparently froze time for a period. Cat, no! It was going to happen sooner or later. Sooner or later, she was going to get it. She wanted so badly. She's been trying for months to get to this thing. Sooner or later, she was going to get it. Gosh. So if it still works. Honestly, I'm going to be honest here. I really don't want cats. Okay, it's like I had a cat for 16 years, from the time I was about 16 to the time I was about 32. I had a cat before that. I had a cat from age 10 to 16. I had a cat for 6 years. A neighborhood cat that's kind of wandered into our backyard one day I should say, a month after I turned 10. I had that cat until right before I turned 16. She died of leukemia. But she was an outdoors cat. Now we kept her in that. She came into the house some, but in fact, we kept at different times over the years. We kept her in the house, but she was mainly an outdoors cat, and she eventually got apparently into a fight with another cat and got leukemia from that cat and died. I was only 16 at the time, so I was very emotional about it, especially when you consider that it was a disease that we could have vaccinated her against, and I felt so guilty about that. So I got another cat, had that cat for 16 years, and that cat got all her vaccinations. And that cat was also an indoors cat that we never let out. When that cat died, I was about 32. It was right after my dad died, about 6 weeks after my dad died, and I was ready to live life without cats. I was completely, perfectly, totally, 100% ready to live life without cats. Absolutely. I got about 2 years of peace without cats, and then I had two of these three dumped into my lap, and another one a year later. And I'm going to admit, there are times that I wonder why. Why did I let myself be saddled with these cats? I gotta admit, I'm past the point in my life where I really want to be dealing with cats. Anyway, so we had the section in the previous chapter about Joshua getting the sun to stand still, or praying to God and convincing him to make the sun to stand still. apparently, the text doesn't actually say why they prayed this. Apparently, it's because Joshua did not want the enemies to run away in the darkness and flee to their fortified cities. He wanted to take them all out in that one big battle that one day. Apparently. It doesn't really say. One of the things we have to accept about the Old Testament in particular is there's a lot of stuff that is stated, but the explanations or motivations are for why are not given. Okay, there's a lot of sections in the Old Testament, especially in the narrative sections, where they're just kind of recording facts, where the what is given, like what happened, but the why is not, like why this happened, or why this character wanted to do this, or why God wanted to do that. God does not explain his motivations very often in the Old Testament, and a lot of times the characters themselves don't explain their motivations. The text just doesn't get into that. For the most part, it really doesn't. So here, when Joshua asks the sun to stand still, we really don't know why. It doesn't actually say why he asked that. He just did. I presume, the answer I could come up with is that he did not want the enemies to flee in the cover of darkness in the night, and he wanted to get them all right then and there. But it doesn't actually say that. I don't really know. So there's a lot of sections like that in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament narratives in particular, where we just kind of have to speculate as to why someone did something, or why God did something, because a lot of God's actions are not explained either in the Old Testament. Now, some of it we can infer from what the New Testament says. The New Testament does provide the whys to a lot of these whats. But there are a lot of things that are recorded in the Old Testament that just, we don't know why these things happen. They just happen. It's like there's no attempt given to explain the motivations or the meaning behind a lot of it. Anyway, and that is, Moses, Joshua, Joshua, we think of Joshua as the conquest, just like we think of Exodus as the Exodus. We think of Joshua as the conquest. But most of Joshua actually is not about the conquest. Half of it, at least, is about the divvying up of the land afterwards. Just like in Exodus, most of Exodus is not about the Exodus. Only the first 15 chapters are about the actual Exodus. Most of the book is about what happened after the Exodus. So we're about done with the part that covers the actual conquest. We only got another chapter of that, period, and then a summary in chapter 12. And then we have a lot of stuff that doesn't mean a whole lot to us today because it's about the tribal inheritances and how they divvy up the land amongst them, which means very little to us today, but it's more important to these people, really, than the account of the actual conquest. Okay, so now we're in Joshua 11, starting in verse 1, of course. Joshua has finished campaigning against the kings of the south, and he is back in Gilgal. So that's the end of the last verse, chapter 10, verse 43 here. Then Joshua returns all Israel to the camp at Gilgal. So now we go on to the next series of events. Chapter 11, verse 1. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Aksaph, and the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphath Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. Now we're going to find out in a few verses that Hazor is the most prominent city of this bunch. So it's the king of Hazor that is leading this alliance. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel slain. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." The Israelites were not to have their own chariot army. They eventually do develop one. It says in Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, when they're talking about the king that they're inevitably going to get down the road in their future, the king is not to acquire a great numbers of horses for himself. God didn't really want them to rely on horses and chariots. So for the good chunk of their history, whenever they're fighting chariot armies, instead of taking over those chariots when they conquer them or defeat them, they're going to destroy the chariots and hamstring the horses, which means they won't be using that stuff themselves. David does this. When David is wandering around, marching throughout Israel, he does not use a chariot army. Solomon will hire one, and then they will develop their own homegrown army in the days after Solomon. But Israel didn't have a chariot army for a long. The technology existed. Egypt had chariots, even as they were chasing them out of Egypt. This is actually one of the points of contention about all this, because we're not entirely certain when the concept of the chariot was even introduced to this region of the world. I believe I've read that it was the Hittites who first came with the chariot. I'm not sure. I personally don't get too fussed over particulars like that, because really, in all honesty, how exactly are we going to know this? I mean, we're talking about events that occurred 3,500 plus years ago, and like how precise do we think we can really get in figuring out where and when the chariot was introduced? It's like we can't even. We can't even decide today when certain things that happened in the last 100 years happened, okay? When certain people had certain ideas to invent certain things today. We can't even agree on that. So it's like, I'm a video game fan, so it's like we can't even agree on who made the first video game, or where or when that happened or in what circumstances. So and that was like 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. It's like I'm really not honestly too fussed over the particulars of who came up with chariots, who had the idea to put wheels on carts and attach those carts to horses to ride around. I'm just, because really, in all honesty, that's something that, as much as we'd like to think we can be precise about that, we honestly really can't. That's just one of those things that we tend to be more arrogant than I think we should be in how precise we can be about determining when that was first introduced. At any rate, the countries around Israel had chariots, and Israel did not. And that would be a condition that would last for several hundred years. Now, part of it is because Israel's geography doesn't really lend itself to chariots. Israel has a lot of hills. In fact, when they go to war against nations, their strategy is always going to be to get their enemies in areas where the chariots aren't useful to them. Because Israel will always be disadvantaged in terms of that. I think God wanted them to be. I don't think God wanted them to have chariot armies. I think that they do eventually develop a chariot army. But I think that actually goes against what God actually wanted. If they have a chariot army, then they can put their faith in their victories, their confidence in their victories in themselves and their chariot army. And I think God didn't want them to have that. Same thing regarding to their numbers. We kind of glossed over it. We mentioned a little bit back in Numbers. But when we read about in Numbers, these numbers of Israelite soldiers, hang on a second, there we go. These numbers of Israelite soldiers in Numbers 1 and then later on number 26. We see this and we think of these in terms of tens of thousands. Okay, so it's like in Numbers 1, the number from Reuben was 46,500, Simeon 59,300, etc., etc. Actually, the numbers we really care about are the ones from the next generation in Numbers 26, because that first generation died out. Reuben 43,000, Simeon 22,000, Gad 40,000, Judah 76,000. Well, those numbers probably aren't really those tens of thousands of people. The LF, or whatever the word is that's describing that, probably doesn't mean a troop of 1,000 men. At least not at this point in time. Now, later in the Old Testament, it might. The reason why I think we can't, no, just don't. Just stay down there. It was so much more peaceful when you were just down there. Why we assign the value of 1,000 to this term is because I think maybe later on it does mean that, but I'm not sure if it means that in Joshua. Because if Joshua really had an army of 600,000 fighting men, then he would have the most powerful army in the world. Okay? And that, I think, is pretty clearly not the case. I don't think God wanted it to be the case. I think God was very determined to make sure that Israel did not have the most powerful army, because then they could put their faith in their victory and their confidence in their victory in themselves. Later on, in the days of the judges, for example, in Gideon's day, we're going to see God deliberately strip away the army from a larger number down to like 300 or something like that. And God doesn't want them to develop a chariot army. So I question whether or not Joshua really had a fighting force of 600,000 men, because if he did, then he would have an enormous numerical advantage over his enemies and would not need to fear them, like he clearly does, because God keeps telling him not to. So that's one area where I think we can be fairly confident in saying that the Israel's fighting army at this point in time was not 600,000. Because that would mean that they wouldn't have to rely on God for their strength and their advantage. If they had an army of 600,000, they would outnumber their foes like 30 to 1. So, and then they wouldn't be afraid. So that probably, anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that in general, throughout all this, we see Israel consistently portrayed as a weak fighting force in and of themselves, that is always at a disadvantage against their enemies, both numerically and in terms of technology. And even here, when they win these battles, they're not taking their enemies' horses and chariots to use for themselves. They've destroyed them. And God specifically tells them that. Okay, anyway, so Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. Joshua likes to get the ambush. He seems to be pretty consistent about wanting to take the fight right to them and not give his enemies a chance to get themselves set for the battle. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. At that time Joshua turned back and captured Hazor, and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them. There's that band, that Shuram, or whatever it's called again, put them under the ban. Not sparing anything that breathed, and he burned up Hazor itself. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. That's actually pretty important. We're going to come back to that in a moment. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword, until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone who breathed. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all the Lord had commanded Moses. So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir, to Baal Gad and the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and struck them down, putting them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. We're going to find out later that the time frame of this conquest was about 6-ish years, probably. So a long time, meaning about 6 or so years. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. Now, I don't know if that means that they could have made treaties of peace. I don't know. I really don't. God said to destroy them, and we read about the idea of signing peace treaties with enemies and far-off nations later on, but not the nations in the land that the Israelites were going to conquer to live in. So I don't know if these people, if the Gibeonites did. I don't know, and Rahab and her family in Jericho did. But I don't know if anybody, I don't know if that option was, maybe, I don't know, I really don't. Maybe they just were so hard-hearted and that they just weren't ever going to. Maybe the idea is that God knew these people were too far gone to repent. They weren't going to. Even if the Israelites had made an offer of peace treaty, they would have been refused. That's very possible. People didn't get to that point, very much so. We see it in our daily lives, and we see it in people around us. You can get to a point where you've said no so many times that you just become unable to say yes. It's like, you just reach a point where you just become so hardened, you've hardened yourself and become so hardened that you're not going to repent no matter what happens. That can definitely happen. We see that all the time. I think we see that unfolding in our culture around us right now. We have become so hardened, and we are so determined to go our own way and live according to our own rules, that even when something like COVID comes along, and clearly shows the futility that of ourselves trying to live by our own rules, and that we really don't have any idea what we're doing. But instead of acknowledging that and repenting and trying to move forward in the humbleness and obedience, we just become more hard-hearted. We just double down. We get more determined, and that's a pattern that we see of human beings reacting to judgment all through the Bible. So it could be that these nations just were not going to repent. They were past the point where that was even going to be an option for them. Except for this one group of people in Gibeon and Rahab's family. It could be that they were just simply not going to do it. Maybe 100 years ago they would have. Maybe that's why God gave them 400 plus years of time to repent, to the time that Abraham was in the land, to the time Joshua and them come back. So maybe if they had, maybe during that 400 years, they just closed themselves up, and then nothing was going to happen. I don't know. I really don't. At any rate, what I know is that none of them did make a treaty of peace, from what this verse right here says. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel. So that's kind of like we saw with Pharaoh. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So they were not going. Oh boy. They were not going to. They were just not going to make a treaty of peace with Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Deber, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. This is kind of interesting, because we seem to be acknowledging a split between Judah and Israel already. I don't know if that means that the final edition of this book was compiled after the split happened in the days following Solomon, because Judah and Israel will split. That'll happen in about 900 or so BC, 930 BC. That's just 400, 500 years away from Joshua's time. I don't know if that means that the final edition of this book was put to pen after that, or if it reflects a division that was always there within the tribes. Maybe the tribes never were that united. Maybe there always was a distinction between some of these tribes, and they never were completely on board. I don't know. From all the hill country of Israel, Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did he destroy. Those are cities on the coast, the south. The coast of Israel, of course, is on the western side of the Mediterranean Sea, and the southern region of that coast is the Philistine territory. And these three cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, are all Philistine cities, and they will be prominent for some time to come. They are not destroyed yet, so they'll be prominent enemies of Israel for quite some time to come. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to the tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. Now we're going to get into a little bit more about specific battles that occurred later on, or during this time, I should say. For the most part, our account of the campaign is basically done here. We said a moment ago that the town of Hazor was the only one that, verse 13, Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mountains, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. In the end, there were only 3 cities during this campaign that the Israelites totally destroyed. And by that I mean burned to the ground. The first 2 they fought, Jericho and Ai, and then Hazor. The rest of them they didn't. Remember that these were the cities the Israelites themselves moved into after they conquered them. But one of the problems that we have, the conquest is one of those things that the smart people today don't want to say happened. They'll say that the Israelites were either already there, or they slowly infiltrated, or whatever. And part of the technical reason for this is that they think they can find no evidence for destruction of these cities in this time frame. Again, as I said before, this is mainly a result of us getting our own timeline wrong. The main reason why we don't see the destruction of these cities in the time frame that we think we should see them in is because we have the wrong time frame. But also something to consider is that of all these cities the Israelites conquered, they only destroyed 3 of them. The rest of them they left standing, and they themselves moved into them. So you're not going to necessarily find obvious telltale signs of destruction because there weren't. You had just a change in occupants. And the Israelites also at the time didn't really have their own culture. They had been nomads in the desert for 40 years. And before that, they had been slaves in Egypt for 100 or more years. So whatever culture they had been Egyptianized, and they didn't really have their own. So when they move into these towns, they basically just take over the culture of these towns. And that's a major threat that both Moses and Joshua kept warning them about, to not become overtaken by the culture of these towns they're moving into. The only three cities they actually destroyed and burned to the ground were Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And all three of those cities, assuming that we've identified Ai correctly, do bear signs of destruction from this period of time. Again, the problem is that we don't think the Israelites did it because we don't have the time frame matched up correctly. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these in depth after we finish the book of Joshua, and we go over Jericho, Ai, and Hazor kind of in depth. Hazor is not done, by the way. In Jericho, the other one of these cities that was never inhabited again was Ai. Jericho would eventually be rebuilt. And Hazor was rebuilt. In fact, we're going to find another guy named Jabin, king of Hazor, who's bothering the Israelites not too far in the future. In the days of Deborah and Barak and in the book of Judges, we have another guy named Jabin, king of Hazor, who is causing problems. And that was only about 150 or so, 170 or so years later. So these cities, despite being destroyed, were rebuilt and were nuisances, except for Ai. Ai, as far as I can tell, was never destroyed. We're not totally certain we know where Ai was, but there is some good candidate sites for Ai that match the description in Joshua 7 and 8. Jericho is still inhabited to this day, and so we know where that is. And Hazor, I don't know if it's inhabited now or not, but I'm pretty sure we know where that is. And those cities do bear signs of destruction. The problem is, again, that we just don't have the time frame matched up with what it actually should be. We've got our labels for our time. I talked before about the filing cabinet analogy. We've labeled the drawers of our filing cabinet incorrectly, so the stuff that we put in those drawers is not in the right place. And so the stuff is there, the evidence is there of destruction. The evidence at Hazor, there is evidence there of destruction, of conflagration, destruction by fire, twice in their history, at the right time periods, but because we've got our time periods matched up and mixed up, we don't see it as being due to the Israelites. The walls of Jericho did come down. In fact, the rubble is still there to this day, but because we think that happened at a different period of time, we don't think it happened at the time of the Israelites. Jericho also has the problem of being a miraculous taking. Ai and Hazor were just battles. Jericho, of course, has the added component of it being a miraculous taking of the city, which, of course, we just don't want to believe that could happen, period. So we're predisposed to be biased against that account from the start. Anyway, so we'll get into that later on, but for the most part, the campaign chat part of Joshua is over. We're going to have a summary here and a little bit more of an in-depth look at some of the things that Caleb did as part of his contributions to the battle. But most of the rest of Joshua is going to be about divvying up the land out they have it.